everybody. Today is Monday, November 25th, and Colonel Jacques Baud is here with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Thank you. Welcome. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Let's get started with what has happened, the new hypersonic missile that Russia used against Ukraine. When you look at this type of escalation, in your opinion, is there any more room for escalation in the conflict in Ukraine? Because it's getting so dangerous right now. And what's your take on what has happened?
Well, we have, I think, first to understand exactly what happened, because my view is that most commentators assume, for instance, that Joe Biden authorized the use of weapons in the depth of Russian territory. I'm not so sure. Of course, now you have those who have been pro-Trump or against, and everybody plays its game there. But my feeling is that we are witnessing something that is even worse, and namely that US has totally lost control over what's going on the Ukrainian side. And we have the same thing with Israel, by the way. We have seen that the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, for instance, was definitely not approved by the US, the same as the provocation against the Iranian consulate in Damascus. That was not approved by the US. They were even surprised that it happened. And on the Ukrainian side, we have seen exactly the same thing. I mean, you had Ukrainian attack on the early warning raiders, the Russian raiders. You had Ukrainian attacks against Russian refineries. You had the Kursk attack. You had and the attack with ATACMS, and all that appears to have been that was not with the full agreement of the US. And it appears that they were surprised by those events. And they told the Ukrainians not to do it again. Meaning that we have a situation where the US, although it started the whole process of this war and it fed this process through weapons delivery and politically and all that, but now we are in a situation where the US seems to have totally lost control. And that's probably why we have this absence of confirmation. It's interesting if you read the transcript of the press briefing of the White House and things like that. Consistently, journalists ask for confirmation, but consistently the spokespersons say that they have no confirmation for the decision of Joe Biden's decision to allow the use of weapons in the depth of the Russian territory. By the way, when we see what happened really on the ground, we see that those weapons were never used in the full range of those weapons. Of course, this can be explained by the fact that the Ukrainians probably need more technical inputs from the US and British or French technicians to achieve greater depth. But I think there is also another explanation for that, is that the Ukrainians didn't receive what they expected to receive in September. Remember that with his victory plan, Zelensky expected to have the authorization of using weapons in the depth of Russia. He didn't. And even Keir Starmer, as he was Keir Starmer, as he talked to Biden in order to have this approval, Joe Biden didn't give the approval. So, meaning that the U.S. probably now tends to, let's say, to anticipate some more escalation and tries to prevent some escalation. But the Ukrainians need that escalation. And they know that they have support for such an escalation in Europe, not in the US, but in Europe. And again, in US, you probably have different views and different opinions on that, especially if you look at the State Department, probably they're more in favor of such an escalation, but the Pentagon is probably not. So you have this kind of confrontation on the US in the US, but you don't have that in Europe. And probably what Zelensky is trying to do is try to drag the US into an escalation that it didn't want. And that's probably why we have those attacks and storm shadow attacks, but in the vicinity of the border. In fact, I mean, it's still on Russian territory, but you remember that in May, as the Russians started the offensive on Kharkov, the Western countries, namely UK, France, and the US, authorized the use of their weapons in the border area in order to strike the following forces, if you want, of the Russian attack. And that means that there was an authorization to strike on Russian territory. But I don't know if there was a specific distance established, but my understanding is that the idea was to be able to strike the second echelon of the Russian offensive. And therefore, what Zelensky is trying to do is trying to extend this range a little bit more and to push the Westerners into a kind of a fait accompli situation in which the Westerners are confronted to a situation they didn't expect in the in first place, but now they are confronted to the situation that they are involved in a conflict with Russia. And that's the reason why we see that there are so little comments on the official side, especially from the US side, about what happened. And on the other hand, that gave Russia an opportunity to send a message to the West in general, to the US in particular, because the hypersonic technology is not new on this theater. We have seen that many times in Ukraine. So, as such, using hypersonic weapons is absolutely not new. What is new is that the Russians have deliberately used a missile that could have a range that reaches up to, I mean, the whole of Europe, basically, and even probably not from Turatam or Baikonur or so, but if you would launch these missiles from the eastern, from the far east of Russia, you could probably reach. I mean, you could not probably. You could reach the U.S. territory, and that's if you look at the at different maps. I can show you this map, for instance, here, and we see that in fact a launch from the Far East, such a missile like the Oreshnik that was used on Dnipropetrovsk, could reach almost all the U.S. territory. So it's not an intercontinental ballistic missile. It's still an intermediate range ballistic missile, but still it can reach the U.S. Territory. So it is clearly a message that is not just towards the Europeans, but also against the US. And that sounds to me very important, because what Putin is saying basically is that the Westerners should regain control over what Ukraine is doing. And that's what I understand from that. And in addition to that, they show that they have the resources and the means to fulfill their promises. And that's also an important factor, because now they have demonstrated that what was so far considered as a theater capability has become a strategic capability. And that pushes the West into a very peculiar position. In fact, I think that Russia is today in the same position as the United States were in 1945 with the nuclear bomb. At that time, the rest of the world was weakened by World War II. The US was affected, but not so much from the war. And it had the ultimate weapon at that time against a weakened world. And now we have exactly the same situation. We have a weakened West and a weakened US, with a lot of weapons are depleted. And we have seen the complaints from the one of the senior generals of the Pacific Command, saying that the weapons are dangerously, the U.S. weapons are dangerously depleted, and that would probably have consequences in a case of war in the Far East. We will not discuss the probability of a conflict there, but what I mean is that definitely we have a US weakened, we have a very strong Russia, and a weapon that nobody can stop. That's the interesting point. Exactly as we had in 1945, I mean, the US had a weapon that nobody could counter, basically. Today, we have a weapon which is non-nuclear, but which gives a definitive edge to Russia. And this is a paradigm change to some extent, because this alleged superiority of the West is now challenged by a technological superiority of Russia. And when I say Russia, I could even include China, because we know that China has a similar capabilities in terms of long-range hypersonic glide vehicles and things like this. So, and we also know that the US has problem with the development of their own hypersonic weaponry, meaning that there is definitely a shift in the strategic balance between the East and the West. And now the East, and in particular in that case, Russia, has this definitive superiority. And this superiority, since it's non-nuclear, may proliferate. And that's what we have seen with the Houthis. You remember that recently the Houthis struck on Israel with these Palestine 2 missiles that are also hypersonic.
In Nevada Air Base.
Sorry, yes, exactly. So we see that this kind of technology may proliferate at the expense of the Western capabilities. The US, in particular, rely very much on very substantial uh, um, naval groups with aircraft carriers and all that. But the precision that was observed with the strike of the Oreshnik missile in Dnipropetrovsk show that, in fact, no naval battle groups is now safe, because this could strike at any point in the globe, basically. A U.S. naval group, without that the U.S. can reply. And it's interesting also that The strike that was done in Dnipropetrovsk was apparently conducted with kinetic ammunition, meaning that they are not explosive per se. It's just a piece of metal, but the velocity of this metal is such that each projectile contains a load of energy that is at the end equivalent to a bomb. But if you think about it, this is exactly what you would use if you would fight, let's say, destroy an aircraft carrier, for instance. You just need to send hyper velocity metal rods, and that would just make the ship to sink. So we have here a demonstration of force which is unprecedented, but also push us back to the situation of 1945. And that, I think, I find it extremely interesting because, um, again, this is something that was totally unexpected, at least on in this context. I think the U.S. expected that such weapon could be um, used, and that explains most probably because if you read at what has changed in the US nuclear doctrine in April 2022, I have mentioned that several times, but apparently in the Western media, nobody paid attention to that changed or the change of doctrine. But if you look at what was published by the Arms Control Association in April 2022, you see that Biden approved a version of the policy from the Obama administration that leaves open the option to use nuclear weapons not only in retaliation to a nuclear attack, but also to respond to non-nuclear threats. And I think, although it's not detailed here, that what the kind of non-nuclear threats that may affect the US in a strategic way are exactly this kind of weapons that are non-nuclear, but they are so powerful and so they have such a speed that it's almost impossible to stop them. And that's probably the rationale behind this change of doctrine, among others. But because there are also other aspects that I don't want to discuss here because it's not the today's subject. But this is an interesting point, and the uh, again, that was totally unexpected on that theater of operation because we expected to see the missile we have seen from the very beginning. You remember that probably 2 weeks after the beginning of the Russian military offensive, you had this strike against a base of foreign volunteers at close to the Polish border in Ukraine. I don't remember the name of the place, but that was apparently an hypersonic missile that struck that place. And that was, again, I think, from the Russian side, that was a kind of a message that would indicate that if you come with more mercenaries and all that, we'll destroy them. And we have weapons that you cannot stop. So that was a very theater related type of weaponry. But now we have a weaponry that goes beyond the theater of operation. In fact, this kind of weapon, the medium range ballistic missile, is is a weapon for a theater of war. I remind you that in the Russian doctrine, Ukraine is a theater of military operation. It's the abbreviation TVD, Teatr Voyennych Действий, the theater of military operation, and that's the designation of Ukraine. Now, a theater of war is the upper level. That means that is a theater that encompasses several TVDs. That's a theater of what? Theater Vienna. And that is that could be Europe, for instance. In the Soviet doctrine at the time, Europe was considered as a theater of war, and individual areas within that territory were theater of operations. And that's exactly what we have seen, and that's the reason why the Russians don't use the word war to designate what's happening in Ukraine, but use the expression theater of operations, because it's a part of a theater of war. And if the that's something we should be very careful about the terminology, because that means that in the mind of the Russians, you may have other TVDs that eventually compose a theater of war. And what Vladimir Putin has demonstrated by using a theater of war type of weaponry on a theater of operation, meaning that if needed, he's ready to escalate to the theater of war. That's the meaning of that launch, besides all the technicalities of the missile itself and all that. So there is a geostrategic dimension of that. And I think the Americans have got it. I'm not sure the Europeans have got it, because they are still in this kind of bravado type of mentality. We have seen the French foreign minister saying that there is no red lines for Ukrainians to use their Scalp cruise missile. I think those guys have not understood what is at stake here and what the Russians are prepared for. So this is it's interesting because, as you know, my career as strategic intelligence officer was during the Cold War, essentially, and we are back to the issues that were raised at that time and issues that we were actually concerned about that didn't happen at that time. But we have the same terminology coming back. We have the same kind of weapons coming back. We have, in fact, we have just seen the Russians bypassing the nuclear, I would say the nuclear barrier, because the nuclear weapons are definitely very powerful weapons, but at the same time, there is a political dimension of them. And by using hypersonic missiles, the Russians have bypassed the political issue related to nuclear weapons, in fact. And that's, I think, an extremely interesting development. That's why I'm saying that it is a change of paradigm in this, not just in this particular conflict, but in the whole balance between East and West. And well, that's what I can say based on what I've seen, and it's a source of concern. It's a source of concern not from the Russian side, because I think the Russians are very aware of the limitations and the risks of such weapons. The problem is that I don't see the same awareness on the Western side. We still have those people who think that war is just a war game, but it's not. And that's where I see the danger. Again, as it is since 2014, as nobody in the West took the Russians seriously, we are having exactly the same behavior today. And this is exactly the kind of behavior that can lead us to the problem. We are poking the bear, as we say, constantly, without having any thought about a possible reaction. We are still in this mindset that Russia is inherently weak and inherently bluffing when it comes with new weaponry or things like this, and that is extremely dangerous, I think.
It
I don't
seems
mean,
that this hypersonic missile that is called Oreshnik, and it's capable of carrying nuclear bombs as well.
well,
And
that I think we are. I mean, first of all, let's be honest. The West discovered Oreshnik on the 21st of November. And there were probably rumors and things like this. And I assume that some intelligence services had probably a little bit more details about it. But my personal view is that we discovered these missiles. I never heard about it before. And I think many of most experts, if not all of the experts that are on the net today, are also discovering this missile. And I assume that as it is an intermediate range missile, it can probably carry nuclear weapons. And at the end of the day, that was the purpose of those weapons during the Cold War. And we can assume this is still their main purpose. But the new thing is that with hypersonic missile, you can gain, excuse me, you can have or achieve the same kind of benefit as with nuclear weapons without having the political weight of it, if you can. And by the way, if you in the past 2 years, many times our media have repeatedly mentioned nuclear tactical weapons, and Putin used tactical. In fact, if you look at the Russian terminology, there is no tactical nuclear weapons. There is no. They don't have it. They don't have it anymore. They used to have it during the Cold War, and they had tactical nuclear weapons, but now they don't, and they know why. Because they know, and as do the Americans, by the way, because you may probably not remember, but I'm old enough to remember that in the 60s, the US had even nuclear guns. So you had those huge artillery guns that could fire a nuclear shell. And that was the idea that we had in the 60s, 70s, that you could have very miniature nuclear devices that you could send. But people realized very fast that when you start using such devices, you put the finger into something that you don't expect the result, because it can drag you directly into an overall nuclear confrontation. And that for that reason, both the Soviets at the time and the US tried to have kind of a doctrine that on both sides, they had different names, but it was on both sides they have this idea to have kind of a controlled escalation of what happened. And that's what the US and NATO called the flexible response, which means that you can escalate gradually from the conventional to the nuclear forces, and that basically they expected somehow that each step would be made with some kind of, probably not negotiation, but you would always consider your enemy before. You don't escalate directly, because then if you reach the point where there is no escalation possible, that means that the world is destroyed. So this idea of controlled escalation. And the Russians have also understood that, but they understood that basically it's useless, because once you start with a small nuclear weapon, you can be dragged into something more. So you have to find something else that gives you an advantage on the battlefield, without addressing the nuclear problem. And that's how they started to develop these hypersonic missiles that can, on the battlefield, we have seen that since now, especially in the last year, where the Ukrainians had very sophisticated Western air defense systems, such as a Patriot and all that. And these missiles were totally ineffective against hypersonic missiles. So the Russians had, in fact, a non-strategic capability of weaponry that could have similar effect as non-strategic nuclear weapons, if you want. And the Russians have more or less replaced those non-nuclear, a non-strategic nuclear device by other kind of devices where you cannot reply with nuclear weapons, because then you are trapped into the nuclear loop, and you don't have the conventional weaponry to counter these missiles. So you are trapped, basically. And that's exactly what the Russians have demonstrated in Dnipropetrovsk a couple of days ago.
When you look at the Russian army today, comparing to what it was before this conflict started in Ukraine, it's a huge transformation of the army. It's a defensive army right now. It's totally prepared for any sort of offensive. And with this new type of hypersonic missiles, how do you think this would change the future of the conflict between Russia and the West? And maybe the Trump administration go after some sort of solution, maybe arms control, some sort of treaty, because the world is getting so much dangerous right now. And the way that they're escalating the conflict in Ukraine, it's unbelievable. How do you see, are they understanding that the Russian army has totally transformed from what it was before and right now is totally prepared to fight each and every country in the West, all of them together? Or
Well,
we are not getting to that point still?
the interesting thing is that if you look at large, also Western armies have been waged war since about 30 years, and they have been everywhere in Afghanistan. Problem is that the experience they gained in those conflicts were irrelevant for the conflict in Central Europe or in Europe, because it was a different type of conflict. Basically, it was counterinsurgency type of conflict, and with adversaries that were not so developed technologically. And for that reason, we see today, and that was, by the way, complaint that came several times from Zelensky and the different Reznikov, the Minister of Defense at the time, the Ukrainian Minister of Defense. They've complained several times that, in fact, the training that was provided to the Ukrainian forces was not adequate for this kind of conflict, meaning that the West has prepared itself for a conflict that is definitely not the kind of conflict we have in Ukraine today. The Russians, on the other hand, are fully prepared for this kind of conflict. And this kind of conflict is extremely complex. Is extremely complex in terms of command and control. When you start fighting against enemies that don't have sophisticated command and control structures or infrastructures, that they don't have extensive electronic warfare capabilities, or air force or counter air force or things like this, it's easy. You just go and shoot, basically. So you don't need to have a sophisticated command and control structure. Doesn't mean that there are no element of sophistication, but in essence, it's an easy type of conflict. It's more difficult for the morale of the individuals, because it requires a lot from the individual soldier. But in terms of command and control, it's relatively easy. The problem with the conflict in Ukraine is that it's exactly the opposite. the constraints on the command and control are enormous, and the recipe for victory in such a conflict is the integration of all your forces, the complete integration of all your forces, meaning that you should be able to once you have a target, whatever the target is, can be a city or a tank or whatever, you need to be able to choose between several resources to address this target, and you should be able to do it within seconds, not within minutes or hours or days, within seconds. Meaning that your whole command and control structure at every level must be fully integrated, and, uh, and thus allowing to have the right assets to be used for the right target, avoiding overkills by using all your assets on a single objective, but using the right asset for the right objective. And that's an extremely complex problem if you look at what you have in front of you on a battlefield. And that's exactly what the Russians have understood already at the end of the Afghan war. And they tried to develop since then an integration of their forces uh, in order to be able to respond very quickly to a situation. And of course, since the end of the Afghan war in 1989, the Russians have developed that, but had no real battle experience until 2015, as they started to support the Syrian forces in Syria. And then the Russians started to develop this kind of integrated battlefield solution. And it provided some results. And of course, it was still an embryo, meaning that you had some elements that could be perfected, and they perfected that. And in the last 2 years, the Russians, I'm not suggesting that they've reached perfection, because in this world, perfection is probably unachievable, but still, they have a degree of ability in command and control that, in my view, is unmatched in the West. And because the West was simply not confronted to the same problem. And that's why, beyond the capabilities of tanks or missiles and all that, you have all these techniques and technical aspects of the battlefield, which are probably well suited for the Russians, and very good equipment. But beyond that, I think what they have improved significantly is the ability to use their equipments, their troops, their forces in an integrated way, in a very, I would even say, in an economical way, meaning that they can use exactly what's needed, not more, not less, but exactly what is needed to address a specific task. And that's why I think the Russians have consistently, in the last 2 years, improved their capabilities, and they are certainly today the armed force which is the most ready for any kind of war, especially on the European or Eurasian continent. On the west side, or the western side, on the other hand, we try to deny this evolution, and we refuse to acknowledge it. And not just in the media, but probably also on the battlefield itself, because the kind of weaponry and the kind of training we provided to the Ukrainians were absolutely not a match for the Russian capabilities. And we knew that. I remember having seen an article, I think it was the Wall Street Journal, but I may be wrong on that, but I think the Wall Street Journal, probably in September 2023, who said, in essence, that the West pushed Ukraine into the conflict knowing that Ukraine would not be able to address the or to be effective against the Russians. But the West assumed that the Ukrainians will find a way to solve the problems, meaning that we have, I would say, even equally consistently uh, refused to acknowledge that the Russians had improved capabilities that are much powerful and more and stronger than what we expected in February 2022. And we even denied it. And what I see, and there are probably some discussions with some staff or different armies in the West, but my view is that this doesn't translate into effective programs of development programs of our armies. And in fact, almost on the contrary, because we see that we have concentrated our efforts on supporting Ukraine. And today, everybody agrees on the fact that Western armies are totally depleted. And they are also doctrinally depleted because they are prepared for addressing an enemy that is not the enemy of today. This is the enemy that they expected 30 years ago, or probably more even. And today we have, I mean, if I see what we have in the Swiss Army, for instance, uh, we have definitely not addressed the lessons that we could draw from the conflict in Ukraine. Definitely not, because we refuse this idea that Russia is strong. So this affects our ability to defend ourselves at the end of the day. So, so be it. But Russia is much stronger, and I think there was even a report by the Supreme U.S. Command in Europe. General Cavoli, he made a report recently that indicates very clearly that the Russian forces are much stronger today than they used to be. And the report he published, I mean, they apparently have a yearly report on that. And the report they had in 2023 was equally clear on the capabilities of Russia. And they were, of course, it's a pure military report. And on that report, we could see exactly the opposite of what we could see or read in the media at the same time. And while our media continue to say that Russia is weak, they don't have enough troops, and so on, they are weaker than the weakest European army, and things like this. This is definitely not the opinion of the U.S. command in Europe. Definitely not. It's exactly the opposite. So we should be very careful in not underestimating our enemy. That's the mistake we have done consistently in the past, even, by the way, as I mean, the West, as we had our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere, we consistently underestimated the capabilities of these. I mean, they were weak forces, definitely, but at the end they won because they understood the war in a more holistic way. And definitely, if these wars were lost not because of the balance of power, because the balance of power was in favor of Western armies, but they were defeats because war is probably wider than the use of weapons. War encompasses a number of aspects that are not limited to weaponry. And if you're weak on weaponry, you can be strong on other aspects, such as population and having the support, indeed the support of the population, or time. Time is a very important factor. The Western armies are not tailored for long time war. While on the in some cultures, like in Afghanistan, for instance, they don't consider time as a problem. I mean, they will take the time necessary, and so there are different aspects of considering war, and the West has consistently underestimated their enemies. And that's as Sun Tzu said 2,500 years ago, as Sun Tzu said, this is the recipe for defeat, when you underestimate your enemy. So where we are.
Yeah. Shifting the gear to the other conflict in the Middle East, that last week we had this breaking news ICC arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant. Here is what Netanyahu said in response, Carl, because I think you can respond to what he said.
The decision of the International Court in The Hague is a modern Dreyfus trial, and it will end the same way. 130 years ago, the French Jewish officer Alfred Dreyfus was falsely accused of treason by a biased French court. In response to these false accusations, the great French writer Émile Zola wrote his monumental essay, Jacques. He accused the French court of anti-Semitic lies against an innocent officer who was later exonerated of all guilt. Now an international court in The Hague, also headed by a French judge, is repeating this outrageous offense. It is falsely accusing me, the democratically elected Prime Minister of the State of Israel, and Israel's former Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, of deliberately targeting civilians. This when we do everything in our power to avoid civilian casualties. We issue millions of text messages, phone calls, leaflets to the citizens of Gaza to get them out of harm's way, while the Hamas terrorists do everything in their power to keep them in harm's way, including shooting them, using them as human shields. The court in The Hague accuses us of a deliberate policy of starvation. This when we've supplied Gaza with 700,000 tons of food to feed the people of Gaza. That's 3,200 calories for every man, woman, and child in Gaza. And these supplies are routinely looted by Hamas terrorists who deprive their people of much-needed food. Yet just in the last few weeks, Israel facilitated the vaccination of 97% of the people of Gaza against polio.
Yeah, I'm gonna cut it out because he's gonna continue with the same rhetoric that he has. But when you look at the reactions that we've got from Netanyahu, from Israel, from the United States, people who are gonna work with Donald Trump, and from the European Union, how do you see the outcome of these different vectors in the West? And are we getting to the point that we are going to see some sort of disagreement between the United States and and European countries? Because we haven't seen this before in terms of the conflict in Ukraine. They're totally in line. But how about the conflict in the Middle East? Are we getting to the breaking point?
Well, the problem is that when we talk about the conflict in the Middle East, we are addressing a conflict for which a large part of the European, not just European, but in Europe, it's significant. You have a large part of the population that have compassion and sympathy and empathy for the Palestinians. Remember that France, as an example, is the largest Muslim country in Europe. And you have a very large number of Muslims in the UK, in Germany, and all that. All these people have sympathy for the Palestinians, meaning that you have this significant part of the public opinion that has this view. And when you see in France, you have quite a significant part of individuals who demonstrate every day. I mean, probably not every day, but very frequently, or tried to do so, because the French government tried to suppress this kind of demonstrations. But in any case, you have this situation that you don't have for Ukrainians or for Russians, because you don't have many Russians, or as many Russians as you have Muslims in our countries. As a result, you don't have the same kind of reaction. So this is a very important factor. An important factor that affects also our view is the fact that you have this, I mean, let's say, byproduct of World War II. That's very significant in Germany, for instance, that they still have this sense they feel culprit of what happened to the Jews in World War II, with right. And but the problem is that affects their behavior today. Now, the problem is that the West has not been able to take some distance with this conflict. I just mentioned Germany and the Jews, and we can understand this German behavior towards the Jews given what happened during World War II. But when you hear Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister, saying that it's legitimate to strike at civilian population if the Hamas is in the population, and that there should be no safe zone for the population when Hamas is in the population. This is the kind of thing that shows that the Germans still have the same mentality as they had in 1941 or 42. Because the lessons of World War II is not that we should love this or that community, that we should have more love for these ones or these ones. This is not the lesson of World War II. The lesson of World War II, and especially the Nuremberg trials, is that we should respect the international law, and that civilian population, regardless of the situation, should be preserved. And we should pay attention to the civilian population. In fact, a lot of what happened during World War II is the consequence of the fact that you had no legislation to protect the civilian population at that time. The Geneva Convention came in 1949, after World War. And of course, you had the rules or legal rules that are derived from the Nuremberg trials themselves. For instance, the fact that a soldier cannot protect himself or hide behind the order he received. Today, I think in the West, I think it's general in all armies, that a soldier has the right not obeying an order if this order is against the international humanitarian law or the law of war. You have even the duty of not obeying this order. And these are the lessons of the respect of the law and the respect of the civilians are the fundamental lessons that we should draw from World War II, besides others, of course. But so, coming back to this arrest warrant of the CPI, the Israelis and a lot of commentators who support Israel in the West say, well, Israel has the right to defend itself. Israel, it was attacked, and therefore it responds, and there is no limits to that. And that's precisely the point. Yes, there is a limit. If someone on the streets punch your nose, you're not allowed to kill him. You can punch his nose, but you cannot kill him. That's the basic principle of self-defense that is generally accepted in most legal system in the West. You are not allowed to use disproportionate force to counter something. If somebody damaged your car, you're not allowed to kill him. You know, you're not even allowed to damage his car, because that would be eye for eye, and that's not the basic tenet of the legal system we have. But in essence, I mean, the response must be proportionate, and therefore, yes, Israel has the right to defend itself, but not at any price, and is not allowed to use weapons like 1-ton bombs to kill one person. This is disproportionate. If you have a Hamas leader somewhere and you want to kill him, then you send a couple of special forces or killers or whoever. They go there, they target the person, they kill him, and that's it. But the problem is that Israel is so poor in intelligence that it has to destroy the whole population to kill one person. You know, that's the problem. And the problem is that such a situation is not allowed by the international law. In addition to that, you're not allowed to practice torture, to abduct children, to take hostages. And that applies to both sides, you would say, but to both sides. That includes the Israelis, who, for instance, jail children without charges, just in order to put pressure on their parents. So this is the definition of hostages. So Israel has currently something like 1,500 hostages that nobody talks about. So this is a reality. So you're not allowed to do that. By the way, these lies about supplying food and all that, this has been debunked. I don't want to go into the details, because I mean I could have a separate lecture on that, because this has been thoroughly debunked. And we know that the food has not reached the population, and I think this is no mystery about that. And again, the fact that you destroy not simply because one of the stated objectives of the Israeli operation in Gaza was to destroy the leadership of the Hamas. Now, they have killed Haniyeh, they have killed Sinwar, they are probably allegedly killed Mohammed Deif. So, objective reached. But why do they continue to fight then? So, you see, there's a lot of question marks around what Netanyahu just said. That, in fact, indicates that he is not in good faith when he is addressing that. This is since the very beginning, and again we have other aspects. For instance, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, has stated in July that the occupation of the Palestinian territory, and namely the West Bank and Gaza, is illegal, and that the Israel and the military should leave that territory, and that other countries should assist Israel in leaving these areas and should not support the occupation. What happened? Nothing. I mean, this advice of the ICG became a resolution that was voted in September or October recently. In any case, that was a General Assembly resolution. In any case, this is international law. And the problem with Israel is simply that it doesn't comply with international law. And it didn't since, I would even say, since 1947, even before it existed. It has never complied with international law. And that's the reason why, for instance, just before joining the United Nations in May 1949, Israel was asked to make a declaration that they would comply with international law, and among others, to recognize, not to recognize, but to implement the right of return for the Palestinians. That was 1949. And since then, the Israelis have never done so. And the situation has even worsened after 1967. And so, again, I don't want to rewrite the whole history, but that's what happened. So, meaning that Israel is a country that has never abide by the international law. So it's Netanyahu is probably one of the many Israeli leaders that should be indicted by the CPI. Now, whether this warrant will be effective or not, we see that even in Europe, you have several leaders who said they will not apply the warrant, and Hungary, for instance. And here we are addressing a second dimension of the whole thing. It is the fact that the CPI has become a political body instead of being simply an international legal body. And it started so when the CPI addressed the question of Vladimir Putin. Russia not being member of the Rome Statute, Ukraine wasn't either at that time. I think since then, in August, Ukraine ratified the Rome Statute and therefore is member of the CPI. But before that, and when Vladimir Putin was indicted, neither Ukraine nor Russia were member of the Russia. Therefore, the decision of the CPI was totally political. So now, how do you, when you see that we go from a legal point of view, a legal technical point of view, to a political one, how can you achieve credibility? And that's exactly the point. And I think Netanyahu will play with that, because Israel is neither part of the Rome Statute. The state of Palestine is. And that's the reason why, by the way, if you read the text that was published by the CPI, you see that the CPI considered the problem of the territoriality of the issue, because you have on the one hand Gaza and West Bank, who are in fact integrated or accepted the rules of the CPI, and Israel who didn't. But the fact that many crimes were performed by Israel on the territory of State of Palestine made them, in fact, subjected to the jurisdiction of the CPI. So we are in a very strange situation in which a country, in fact, refused this jurisdiction, but the jurisdiction itself has played a role beyond its own role and therefore has lost some credibility. I think that's also important to take note. I mean, if you are in, I mean, I'm not a legal advisor or so, but I've studied enough law, humanitarian law in particular, to say that if you want to stay credible, you need to remain on your track. And if you start being politician, then of course you lose your credibility, and that's exactly what's going on. I remember I've been several years, I lived in Africa and worked in Africa, and many times I've been also been working, I'm not saying with, but because it was not with, but it was probably more against somehow, not against either, but besides, let's say, the CPI in conflict areas. And for Africans, and not only Africans, but that's what Africans told me, they said, well, the CPI has been created to indict African leaders, but not Europeans. And as a matter of fact, all these Western leaders who have been responsible for war crimes in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, and elsewhere, they are never indicted. So in that sense, the decision of the CPI towards Israel is a first, and that's interesting in that respect. But I think at the end, Netanyahu will never be indicted, and there are several, and that's also the problem with this with this court, because you see, Vladimir Putin was indicted because of alleged abduction of children. We know that these children were in fact withdrawn from dangerous areas to be with the agreement of their parents, by the way, to be put in Russia to receive education and all that. And a US journalist, by the way, has discovered these guys, and I've seen these children and seen that they were educated, they were playing music and attending school, and they are well accommodated in hotels and things like this. So there's absolutely nothing. These are definitely not abducted children or things like that. They are there with the agreement of their parents, and there is no question. So, meaning that, for instance, in the case of Putin, my view is that he will never be indicted, even if let's assume he would be arrested by some countries. If you bring him before justice, what kind of evidence you will provide to indict him? You know, this is why you are shooting in your own foot, because there is nothing to demonstrate that he abducted children. These are only allegations that we use in our narrative to show that, and basically in that case, that was based on Ukrainian allegations, period. But there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that the Russians abducted children. They entered Ukraine to protect the population of the Donbass, not to abduct their children. This makes absolutely no sense. So we are in a situation that these guys will never be, even if they're arrested, they would never be trailed or put in front of a court. And I think that would be exactly the same with Ismail Haniyeh or Yahya Sinwar or Mohammed Deif. Because everything we say about the 7th of October has been debunked by Israeli journalists themselves. And for that reason, regardless of what happened, I mean, in fact, they have been killed in between. But even if they were alive, I think nobody would like to see them in front of the court, because that would expose the lies that we have been consistently proliferate or we have said in order to make the Palestinians, or to blame the Palestinians, and to hide the fact that the war crimes were in fact performed by the Israelis themselves. And it's interesting when you talk about babies, the 40 babies, it proved wrong. The babies in the oven proved wrong. The mass rapes proved wrong. And all these lies that we come consistently with lies, and we see that these lies are debunked a few weeks later on all that. You never see that from the other side. The allegation of the Hamas against Israel are never debunked because they are evidence, because they are not just allegation, they are demonstrated crimes. And that's something that we see on both conflicts, in Ukraine and in Palestine. That you were on one side, namely Ukraine and Israel, in fact, conduct their war based on a narrative. The narrative is a key aspect of their strategy, because based on that narrative, they gather the international support. Because if without this narrative, nobody would support them. And this narrative is demonstrably wrong. And that's the fascinating factor in that the more we proceed in time, the more we see that all this narrative was simply wrong. I mean, Putin is crazy, is sick, is that Russia destroyed Nord Stream, and all that. You wait just a few weeks and you see it was wrong. So we are jumping from lie to lie on one side, and when we look from the other side, we don't see that. Basically, maybe the Russians tell us lies, but we cannot really demonstrate that. And in the media, probably you have some allegation provided by some guy on TikTok or so, and probably you can say the Russians lie also. But these are not official lies, if you want. And that's the interesting aspect of all that, is that we have kind of an institutionalized lie on one hand, and on the other hand, people just bring evidence, period. And that is this kind of dissymmetry in the way the war is waged is, in my view, a significant aspect of the warfare today. I come, as I said, as you know, from the strategic intelligence. In my time, strategic intelligence was used to let's say, help decision making or to support decision making. That's the purpose of intelligence and nothing else. It is to support decision making. But today, we see that intelligence is used to give some kind of credibility of for lies. So we distort the use of intelligence in order to, let's say, install a narrative and give some credibility to a narrative which we know is wrong, but which is necessary to gather the support of the international community. And that's exactly what is currently, in those days in which we are talking, what the rest of the world understands. And that's why you have less and less people who support Israel and less people who support Ukraine, because they see that what we have been told so far in our media since 2 years just starts crumbling, and everything we assume to know for sure are in fact just lies. And And I think if the situation continues to degrade in Ukraine, for instance, we will learn a lot of those lies afterwards, and some have already come slowly to the surface. We had this recently with the so-called Netanyahu leaks or things like that in Israel, that showed that Netanyahu in fact manipulated the media about the negotiations and the Philadelphia corridor and things like this. So we see that there is a manipulation, because again, both Ukraine and um, and Israel are probably good reason to fight, but they are not legitimate in the way they fight. They were not legitimate in the way they because in both cases, I mean, recently I saw in France was a very pro-Israeli politician who said that in Gaza is Russia and Israel is Ukraine. And at first glance, I said, no, that's wrong. That's the reality is upside down. But in fact, if you think well about it, it is so. Why? Because in both cases, you have a population, the Palestinian in one hand, the Russians, the Ukrainian Russians on the other hand, who have been oppressed and slaughtered by the power that was supposed to protect them. Because we tend to forget that Israel, as occupying power in the occupied territory, Israel is responsible to protect the Palestinian population. Is responsible to protect them, not to destroy them. And in Ukraine, the Kiev government was supposed to protect equally the Russian-speaking and the Ukrainian-speaking population. But during years, they fought against them as the Israelis against the Palestinians. And in both cases, those population decided to react. Because when we talk about the Ukrainian conflict, we say the Russians attacked. But it's not exactly true. Because if we look carefully at what happened on the 24th of February 2022, you had in fact three armies that attacked the Ukrainian forces. You had the Russian army, this is definitely clear, but the Russian army was in support of two other armies, and namely the Donetsk Republic militia and the Lugansk Republic militia. These were independent armies, and at the beginning of this operation, the three armies were in fact coordinated by the general staff in Moscow. But they were separate armies, and that explains, by the way, why you had such difficulties in the Donbass, because those militias in the two Donbass republics were not so well prepared as the Russian forces. And that's we can see these the differences. And today, all that has been harmonized since September 2022. You remember that you had referendum in the 4 regions of Ukraine. They accepted to be part of the Russian Federation. And since then, the Russian Federation re-equipped and retrained and reshaped, if you want, these militias, and today those militias are fully integrated into the Russian forces. So since September 2022, we have a different configuration. But what happened in February, that was a population that decided to fight against those who oppressed them. The same as what happened in October 2023, when the population, and not just the Hamas, because when we say Hamas, we feel that this is not representative of all the Palestinians. This is just a small faction. These are just terrorists and all that. Remember that there were about 20 different groups cooperating with it was a coalition, in fact, that attacked the Gaza division, the Israeli Gaza division. And so that was an uprising against an oppressor. So we have a very similar situation. On both sides, you have a state that tends to disregard the humanity of its subordinate population, and this population just take arms and fight back. And you had the same in the two situations. So there are some similarities, but it's not very a surprise. I mean, Netanyahu is a Pole. Smotrich is also coming from Ukraine. You had a lot of those people. In fact, they have the same kind of culture. And I remind you that you had in in July 2021, the Ukrainian parliament adopted a law that gave different rights to the Russian speakers as of the other Ukrainian citizens. And in fact, with that law, according to a deputy of the Rada, so the parliament, the Ukrainian parliament, the Russians had no constitutional rights anymore. So we have a very similar situation when you hear the declaration of Yoav Gallant talking about Palestinians such as human animals and things like this. So you have the same kind of understanding of these population from, let's say, you had a dominant population and a slave population, if you want. And in both cases, you have just an uprising from this population. So this is exactly what the CPI is addressing when it addressed this mandate. But again, as I said, nobody will be willing to do so. The Americans, I mean, some politicians, I think it was Lindsey Graham, the famous one. I mean, is the famous one, but even threatened countries that would implement this arrest warrant against Netanyahu. He said that the US would crush their economy. So meaning that this is, again, we are talking about mafia-like behavior. If you do that, we'll kill you. That's simply what he's saying. This is, I mean, how can you have a country like United States as a partner when this partner says, if you do what you want to do, I'll kill you? But this is not a partner. So regardless of whether it's Trump or not Trump or whoever, basically, by the way, we have no difference between Trump and the others. So I say that here. I don't see much difference. But in any case, how can you have such a country as a partner that threatens you if you don't agree totally with him, and if you are not doing what he wants you to do? And that's the same with Israel, by the way, because of course they don't have the power to crush economies, but at the same time they will threaten you, and they will probably even, I mean, this has been the case in the past, they kill some individuals and all that. So how can you, how is it possible to develop so international relations with people who think that if you are not with them, you are against them, and therefore you can be killed for that? This is not the way I understand international relations.
Colonel, right now in the southern Lebanon, we've learned just yesterday, Hezbollah had 51 operations on Israelis in terms of rocket missiles against their tanks and all of those operations together. Do you find it right now is Israel capable of sustaining this type of war in southern part of Lebanon, or they need more help, more aid from the United States, because it doesn't seem, I don't know if the Trump administration would be interested in escalating the conflict in the Middle East. But on the other hand, the Israelis are pushing for more aids and for more ammunitions, even continuing this conflict. Ben Gvir today said that he knows the capability and the limitations of Israeli army, but they want to finish the job in southern Lebanon. Is Israel capable of defeating Hezbollah from what we've seen so far, or they're just dreaming on?
Well, my feeling is that there is something which is, there is a kind of dissymmetry here between Hezbollah and and the Israeli forces, let's say, not the politicians but the forces. Is that the Israelis fighting in Lebanon are fighting on a foreign territory for an objective that is not very clear, by the way, and nobody understands exactly what the objective is. While on the Hezbollah side, it's the fourth or fifth time they are invaded by Israel. They are they have bombings, regular bombings, not just during this last year, but also before. I mean, Israel violates the Lebanese sovereignty almost daily. I mean, if you read the reports of the UNIFIL, the intermediary force of the UN in Lebanon, you will see that Israel violates constantly the Lebanese sovereignty. So these guys in Lebanon know why they fight, while the others don't know why they're fighting for. And that makes a huge difference. And that's the same thing you have in Palestine, by the way. The Palestinians know why they are fighting for, while the Israelis start to doubt what they are fighting for. That's why they have to invent this idea that the Israeli wants to exterminate all the Jews and things like this, and they want to kill. I mean, you have constantly this narrative about, for instance, the charter, the Hamas charter of 1988, instead of taking the latest charter, which doesn't talk about killing Jews or destroying all the Jews and all that, and that's the charter of 2017. But we have to invent such a situation just to try to find a rationale, because there is no real rationale behind or beyond the this kind of biblical messianic approach of international relations. So there is here a dissymmetry, clearly, but more factually, we see that the capabilities of Hezbollah have improved. And recently, I've seen that Hezbollah has been able to launch missile up to 150 kilometers south within Israel, meaning well south of Tel Aviv. So, meaning that these capabilities of Hezbollah are just increasing with time. And there is more incentive for Hezbollah to use those weapons against cities and things like this. Although you see that the Hezbollah has so far exerted a lot of restraint in using those weapons, but slowly we go to the point that people are losing passions and are ready to use these weapons more, let's say, ruthlessly. And that's a situation that is for Israel unsustainable. And I think there is no doubt that the Americans, and especially Trump, will continue to support Israel. Then we may have technical limitations, because I'm not sure the US has the equipment that is required by Israel and all that. But that's a technical aspect. But beyond this, I think with time goes, as time goes, we understand that it's not about the number of weapons and the number of missiles and all that, because Israel so far has shot so many shells and bombs against, and that doesn't solve the problem. So the solution is not in the number of weapons. The solution is somewhere else. And that's exactly the somewhere else that we have to address. And namely, to have a way to talk, to have a dialogue, and to have a situation where we can accept somehow to live together. Whether it's in one country or in two countries, I don't know. This is up to them to decide, not up to me. But regardless of the solution, there is obviously the solution will be beyond weaponry. And that's the key point. So probably we can continue to supply Israel with aircraft, with whatever they want. Probably we can. I don't know, although there are some obvious limitations. But let's assume we can produce and we can provide and all that. This will not solve the problem. So we have to have kind of a mature thinking here and start to address the problem, to address the root causes of the conflict. As I mean, you know, I've been in the after leaving the intelligence, most of my life has been in conflict management in the field and crisis management and all that. And there is no way you can solve a situation if you don't address the root causes in some way. Even mentioning those root causes is sometimes already a first step. But mentioning, I mean, acknowledging that there are root causes and the real root causes, and not the one you have invented yourself. You know, this idea of I used to be here 2,000 years ago, so that belongs to me. This is something that is not sustainable. These kind of things, nobody believes that. I mean, you try to convince yourself that it's a reality, but nobody will believe that, especially not when the price paid for acknowledging this kind of reality is torture, jailing people and maiming people and killing people, and especially children and all that. And when you have, in addition to that, I saw recently, that was published last month, the report of the UN saying that they observed a pattern. That means the strategy of Israel to address medical center and medical facilities. So they could identify a pattern in the way and in the way of addressing medical facilities, to destroy what is essential for life. So when you see such thing, even if 3,000, 5,000 years ago you were here before, okay, but it doesn't allow yourself to behave like a thug today. I would even say that if you were there before, you would even less behave like this. And as a reality, as we said, most of those people, I mentioned Netanyahu, Smotrich, and others, they don't come from this region. They have never had, even their ancestor had never had any kind of relationship with this region. That's a reality. You have local Jews, but those who rule Israel today have no physical ancestors' ties with Israel whatsoever. They come from Central Europe, and they have this mentality of Central Europe. And that's why they come in a region with this kind of mentality this kind of European arrogance some way. And they make war like this. So if you consider a war just like this, there's absolutely no way you will have a victory, and that it's not sustainable. So I think people start to realize this, and not just the West, because I think this is also something that the neighbors of Israel start to realize, that there is something else that is needed here. And that probably explains why you have this sense of solidarity between Saudi Arabia, Iran, Syria, and Lebanon, for instance. And that will increase with time, most probably, because they realize that the situation that exists in the Near East is totally unsustainable, and there is no way Israel will be able to, let's say, force its way in that manner. So we have to find another solution here, and I hope the Americans will understand that. But the problem is that I'm not sure, looking at the people Trump has selected as or nominated as a member of his team, I'm a little bit pessimistic about this. I'm not sure that they are. They probably won't. They probably don't want to have this conflict on the news. So that's probably true. They are probably fed up with having that on the news, because it has also an impact on the US society. So they would like to have this solved, but I'm not sure they understand the whereabouts, and I'm not sure they are ready to solve the conflict in a way that is just and sustainable, and that is satisfactory for all the stakeholders. That's my concern. And what we hear in the West is not very encouraging either, because again, Annalena Baerbock. Okay, I'm not sure this is the sharpest knife in the drawer anyway, but still, this is a person which is in place. I mean, these are official leaders, probably not for long, because in Germany they will have some elections on the 23rd of February. But nevertheless, they are now in charge, and the intellectual weakness of these leaders is for me a source of concern, because we see that these people are not even open to understand. They're not able to understand. They don't have the intellectual ability to understand what is going on there. They are just within some kind of ideology or things like that, but they are not able to understand what is really at stake there. And more generally speaking, we see that the Western leaders in general, and that applies as well for the US, by the way, because Trump might be better than Kamala Harris, but at the same time, nobody is very much satisfied by him. So we see that the quality of the leadership in the Western world is degrading very fast. And we see that people like Macron and the people around him, they are people without a real culture. I mean, they probably can quote some kind of literature people, and think they can probably quote people, but that's where the culture stops. They are not able to understand things. And since they are not able to understand what's going on, they tend to react by limiting the freedom of expression, because they are not able to counter the argument. I mean, I I could defy any journalist to discuss with me on the question of Palestine on TV, but they will not, because they don't know what's going on. They don't know. They haven't really studied the things. They react just based on what they feel or what the picture they have, but it's not a, a specific, a profound knowledge of what they're talking about. But the same applies to Russia, China, Iran. I mean, we just have prejudice, but not really studied what is really at stake there, what is really going on. And the problem, again, I always say, if someone of you people walking on a sidewalk, they can think A, B, or C about Iran, Russia, Israel, or Palestinians. This is not a problem. The problem is when your leaders tend to have this kind of simplistic and primitive understanding of the reality, because they are decision makers and they are supposed to make decisions. And the proof they are not able to make decisions, and the proof they are intellectually unable, is that they have to prohibit people to express themselves. I mean, this is interesting that, as I told you before, I was a Cold Warrior because I used to experience the Cold War. And even if the communist system was definitely what we didn't want to have in Europe, and we had this situation of Cold War, you could still have Soviet literature, the Pravda and Literaturnaya Gazeta. You had them in any paper store in Europe. You could have them in Paris, in Bern, in everywhere. They were available. You could read them. There were no restriction. There was no, and if you wanted to have a meeting talking about the merit of the Soviet society, you could do it. Nobody would prevent you to have a conference about the benefit of being Soviet or whatever. I mean, that happened. And but today, would you have such a meeting about Russia or about China or about Palestinians? You would be forbidden quickly, and you would have the police, and you would be even accused of being apologist for terrorism, or supporting terrorism, or things like this. So that indicates an intellectual weakness, a profound intellectual weakness of our society. And because at the end of the day, nobody can argue with you. And again, when I talk about, I was in a debate about Ukraine last year, and where I was confronted with two university professors of the University of Brussels, and me and a friend of mine, another journalist, and those two professors at university. So you would expect them to know about the situation, to have a profound and academic understanding of the situation. But no, these guys had exactly they just told us the headlines that you can read in any kind of paper, that Putin is that, is sick, is that, and Ukraine is strong, and Russia will lose, and things like this. I mean, you say, well, but is that the academic world that you could expect? This is extremely poor. You can find, well, it's in French probably, but you can find this on YouTube, by the way. And these two professors were so miserable, intellectually miserable, that you can really ask yourself about the capabilities. There is no ability to discuss something because simply they don't know what they're talking about. Simply that. And the same applies to our leadership. And more, what also concerns me is that my former colleagues, or let's say my colleagues or my former my former organization in intelligence, it is the same thing. They don't have the slightest understanding of what is going on. They just read the papers and that's it. Basically, they probably repeat what is the the narrative provided by the politician, and certainly they don't want to disturb that, because at the end of the day, when you are intelligence, as I said, the purpose of intelligence is to support decision making, meaning that at a certain point you will have to be confronted to the politician, and if the politician has a certain view, then as an intelligence person you should have the courage to say, sir, I'm sorry, that's the reality as we know it. If you want to interpret that your way, that's your problem. But the reality is as I present it. That's the objective, the factual. This is the factual reality. This is based on fact, not simply on my view. These are not my view, these are facts. But if you want to have your views based on what I'm saying, that's your problem. But then don't dictate me what I tell you. You can elaborate on what I'm saying, that's your freedom. But what I'm saying, in good conscience, after studying the problem, but it happened to me to be in such a situation that your superior, or a minister in that case, doesn't agree with you because he has another perception. And you should have the courage to say, well, that's your view, but I'm not changing the reality for you. That's the reality. If you don't want to accept the reality, that's your view, and you are paid and elected or paid for making decisions. That's your problem. But then you have. I remember in November, that was about 20 years ago. No more than 20 years ago. It was in November 2002. That was just before the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and it was all the question of the weapons of mass destruction. And I was responsible for the contact with the United Nations in the foreign affairs. I was a military advisor to the foreign affairs and in contact with the UN mission that was sent to Iraq, and I even provided 2 experts from the. We have a center in Switzerland that is specialized in weapons of mass destruction. Nuclear and chemical weapons. So we sent 2 experts there. And therefore, when these guys came back, I had to report to my minister, and I wrote a report saying that there is no weapons of mass destruction whatsoever in Iraq, and what Iraq is saying is perfectly right, and that was confirmed by Mr. Blix and all that. People told me they didn't try to convince me of the opposite, by the way. That's interesting. And but they said, well, you're probably right, but at the end of the day, the US is a big partner of Switzerland, will not go to confront the US, so you're probably right, but we will do as the Americans want. That's their right. By the way, it's a little bit sad when you look at with distance and when you look backwards. And this is sad because you know that you were right. You know that there was an opportunity to avoid kind of endless wars, but people didn't want, because they didn't want to be confronted to the US and all that. It's a lack of courage, it's a lack of integrity, it's a lack of, let's say, seriousness in doing business. And well, that's the way it is. At the end of the day, you have to accept that as a servant of the state. That's the reality. But nevertheless, this didn't change my report. I'm not changing my report for that. This is how we did it. We did that in good faith, with all the facts, and there is no way I will change a single comma in that. That's your responsibility, and you'll take the responsibility of not considering what I'm writing, what I've written. So that's the problem, and the issue here is precisely this one: is that we don't have the people who are ready to stand up and say, no, this is not the reality. In the media, everywhere, and even when you have someone wanting to do so, since nobody is able to respond, we just prevent you to speak, and we charge you with. I mean, that it didn't happen to me, but we charged a person with supporting terrorism or things like that. So this is extremely perverse. But at the same time, it's totally against the way the rule of law should work. And it's against the way democracy should work. Because at the end, we are reinstating some kind of autocracy. So I don't know if Russia is an autocracy, but I can certainly say that what we are heading to or towards in Europe, in Western Europe, is autocracy. If not against, obviously there are some difference. France is already an autocracy, Switzerland not yet. So there are some differences, but we are heading towards this. And the reason for that is that the leadership is not able to have its own understanding of events. So they are not able to even argue against you. Therefore, they suppress you. That's the easiest way to address the problem. But it doesn't solve the problem.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, Colonel, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
That was my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you.